Good evening, tonight is the final installment of the Sin series, where we have gone through to examine the models that Jewish tradition uses to be able to teach us more vividly about the nature of sin, or perhaps even more directly about the state of sinfulness. And that as we, during the season of the year, struggle with these ideas, try to figure out the path to tshuva, to being able to really engage this idea of overcoming sin, to look at different ways that the Masorah describes sin in order to find those models that work best for us at the season of life, the season of the year that we are in, to be able to more effectively confront the reality of sin in our own lives. Yesterday was 9/11. It was the 20th anniversary of the attacks on the Twin Towers, on the Pentagon, on the United States. Certainly a solemn day in the history of the nation. And for any of us who lived through those events of September 11th, the vivid memories that we have of the trauma, really of the national trauma that was experienced on September 11th really is bubbling up to the surface, I think, for many of us. So what's interesting is that our topic for today, the notion of sleep, right? Sleep as a metaphor for sin, is something which very much was current at the time of 9/11, right? The notion that the United States, prior to 9/11, had essentially been dozing through the danger, that notwithstanding even the attacks on the World Trade Center in 1993, right, the sense that we as Americans had of a certain imperviousness, a certain obliviousness, right, to the notion of living in a dangerous world, and the painfully rude awakening of realizing just how fragile our world was, that the metaphor of waking from sleep was one that was extremely current in the time. And in fact, within the week of 9/11, President Bush is quoted as having said, "They have roused a mighty giant." And that imagery that we, as whether we're talking about failures of intelligence, of military, of leadership, right? But again, even on a more broad societal level, the idea that there was a certain kind of sweet sleep of the pre-9/11 world, and again, certainly the in retrospect, kind of the naivete of the rhetoric of the 1990s, with the Cold War having come to an end, the end of history as it was dubbed, and the idea that perhaps that we've emerged into this new, wonderful globalist world, right, where everything is going to be hunky-dory, right? All of that explodes literally on 9/11. And what's interesting is it's not just a question of the larger societal issues. The Washington Post on December 11th, 2 months later, reported about a tremendous spike in sleep disorders, right? That people really were so disturbed by the events of 9/11, so haunted, right? That there was a spike in the ability to sleep. And they told a poignant story about a woman who had repeated nightmares about seeing her family attacked and killed by home invaders, right, after 9/11. She writes, he says, that before September 11th, I used to be very calm and sleep all night. I don't actually remember having any good dreams anymore, just bad dreams. And my patients are telling me they're experiencing the same thing. So the idea that September 11th actually is if we want to understand this metaphor of sleep and the disturbance of sleep in terms of our relationship with sin, it's certainly that this is a particularly poignant weekend to be discussing it. So what I'd like to begin with in terms of examining the question of sin as sleep is to bring us to perhaps the central text for Yom Kippur, which is the book of Yonah. So the book of Yonah, of course, begins as the story of the prophet who is charged by God with a mission. And the Vilna Gaon famously said that the story of Yonah is to be understood, at least on some level, as allegorical. The idea that Yonah represents the neshama, which is sent into the world, that every Jewish soul is charged with a divine mission. And it's a mission that, for the most part, that we are to varying degrees trying to evade, right? And the idea of how the mission willy-nilly catches up with us, right, is part of the message of the book of Yonah. So let's take a look at the imagery. Right? So God sends this great storm, this great wind to the sea. Right? And there's a tremendous storm at sea, and the ship is about to be broken. And certainly, again, another kind of metaphor that certainly with what we've seen, the horrible hurricane recently, we can kind of picture the scene, right? The storm tossed ship at sea, and it tells us this tremendous reaction. The sailors are terrified. There's this tremendous religious outpouring. They're all crying out, each one to their own God. They're throwing everything overboard, right, in the hopes of lightening the ship, and the ship will be more limber, right, in being able perhaps to navigate its way through the storm. And Yonah went down to the inner parts of the boat. And Yonah there lays down and is sleeping. Now, there are two ways of reading the end of the pasuk, and again, there's probably a sharper grammatical way of phrasing this. So one possibility is to say that Yonah, that with the second half of the pasuk, right, this clause, Yonah had gone down to the ship, right, that this is in past tense. In other words, right, that Yonah that we're contrasting the scene perhaps above deck, right, where there is pandemonium, right, in reaction to the storm. But Yonah somehow is sleeping through the whole thing. He had gone down to sleep, he tucked himself in, right, and that he's missed all of these things that are happening. Alternatively, right, one can read the pasuk sequentially, right, that while everyone else is reacting by screaming, by taking action, by trying to deal with it, the Yonah is actually, his reaction is going to sleep. And the idea that what Yonah is doing, right, one way perhaps of dealing with a trauma that we don't want to deal with, right, a problem, an issue that is so overwhelming to us, there's the idea of sleep being a metaphor, being a vehicle, right, for denial and escape. I don't want to deal with this, right? I want to go in, put the blanket over my head, hide under the covers, right, and keep the problem at bay. Now, again, obviously that does not deal with it, right? It's a mechanism of escape, right? But it's a very human kind of mechanism. So these two models are what I call the sleep of reverie versus the sleep of denial, or if you prefer, the sleep of escape, right? There's two ways, right, that sleep is used as an avoidance, right, of these kinds of problems. One is perhaps more conscious than the other. So as a metaphor, right, of the reality of the state of sinfulness that we find ourselves in, right, the idea that we allow ourselves to be unaware and unreactive to sin comes in two ways, right? So one is the idea, right, that we have been lulled into a sense of sleep, right? We don't feel any kind of tension. We don't feel any kind of regret, right? We've been kind of, lulled into a state of sleep, and therefore we feel no need to deal with the question of sin, right? We've lulled ourselves into a state where we're not able to deal with it. Alternatively, right, there's a sleep that comes out of an active desire to escape, right? And again, if we put this again into a setting, right, in terms of our relationships with other people, right, the idea of instead of wanting to repair relationships, right, that it's so difficult to deal with, right? We don't want to have that confrontation. We don't want to have the conflict. We don't want to deal with something that we're not sure how to deal with. So the idea is that we can build a slumber around us, right? We can go into active denial. Now, again, in Yonah's case, right, going to sleep doesn't deal with the real problem, right? The storm continues to rage, right? And while the sailors are reacting both religiously and tactically in terms of dealing with it, Yonah just wants it to go away. So it's fascinating. There's a famous medrash in Shir and Rabbi that tells us that the Jews almost slept through Matan Torah, right? And the idea is, was that a question of that again, that the sleep itself was more attractive, right? And they just got that the sleep stopped them from realizing what they really wanted to do, or perhaps they were really ambivalent about receiving the Torah. It was easier to sleep, right, than to go into this awesome and terrifying encounter with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? So the question is, right, in reflecting on where we are at, can we connect to this idea, right, that one way or another, either because our life has lulled us into a false sense that everything is fine, or perhaps that we have fled to dull our sensitivity because we don't want to deal with the awesome weight of sin, right? That's the metaphor, right, of the sinful state being sleepful. So what happens? So the next pasuk tells us, "Vaykravi lav Rav Chovel," right? The captain, the head of the master of the ship, comes to Yonah. He says, "What are you sleeping for? Kum cry lokecha. Cry out to your God. Maybe God will pay attention to us. We won't be destroyed." So this is itself like a remarkable part of the story, right? Yonah, and again, in certain ways, you talk about Yonah wanting, Yonah's sleep as escape. Certainly Yonah himself, right? Clearly his whole goal is to escape from God, to escape from consequences, to not to deal with it. But what happens, right? In the most unlikely of circumstances, the captain of the ship, right? The ship, which was to be the vehicle of Yonah's escape, right? He comes to him and wakes him up and he says, "What are you sleeping for? Cry out to your God," right? And imagine, in other words, Yonah hears this, right? Yonah is trying to escape from God. And the captain himself is trying to wake him up and say, "You got to go find your God," right? The Yonah was blown away by that experience. So the famous Rambam, it's a Rambam in Ilchos Tshuva. So where the Rambam talks about the shofar. Now it's interesting. The Rambam develops all of the laws of shofar. We have a whole volume in the Rambam, Hilchos Shofar, V'Sukkah V'Lulav, the beginning of which deals with, if you want to know what a tzkiya is, what a trua is, how a shofar, what makes a shofar invalid. You look in Hilchos Shofar, excuse me. If you want to know what the shofar is about, that the Rambam tells in Hilchos Shofar. And the Rambam says, even though it's Kiyas Shofar on Rosh Hashanah, is in the end of the day, we do it because God told us to. He says, but there is a hint within the shofar. What does the shofar say? Uru yeshena mishnastem. Wake up, you sleepers, from your sleep. V'hakitzun yudamim mitar d'maschem. And slumberers, awaken from your dozing. Right? So again, put this back with Yonah, right? That is the sense. The shofar is the Rav Chovel. The shofar is there. The job of the shofar, right, is to wake us up to the reality, right, that we have, right, consciously or otherwise, right, blotted out through our sleep. Wake up! Do tshuva, remember your creator. He says that we forget the truth, right, due to all of the futilities, the temporary futilities. You waste most of your year with emptiness. Look inside, right, and abandon your evil way, right? So that the way that if the Rambam wants to describe the process of Rosh Hashanah transitioning to Aseret Yemei Tshuva to Yom Kippur, that the language that he uses, it's the language of wakefulness, right? It's the language that the shofar comes to awaken us from the slumber that we are in. So Soloveitchik gave a remarkable metaphor for this. And those of you, I believe later I will add the link. Those of you who speak Yiddish, this talk from Soloveitchik, we have there's a recording of it with subtitles. And my Yiddish is lousy. But having read through it first in English, it's unbelievably, you see the power of the man as an orator, even without really knowing the language. It's an incredible thing to hear. So the Rebbe told the following story in a Tshuva Drasha in 1975. he said that on the 7th day of Pesach in 1967, he suddenly wakes up in the middle of the night. Says there's a thunderstorm, thunder, lightning, wind, rain is coming in through the open window in his room. So he's half awake. He jumps up, he slams the window shut, and then he realizes the Rebbitzin is sleeping downstairs, right, in the sunroom next to the parlor. And he was concerned, if I don't close the window, never, she's not well, she's going to get pneumonia, which is so dangerous in her condition. So he runs down, he slams the window in his wife's room, and he turns around, and he says, I found the room empty. The couch where she slept nearly covered. And he says, only then did he remember his wife had died a month before on Tainus Esther. So he said the most tragic and frightening experience was the shock that I encountered in the half second when I turned from the window to find the room empty. I could have sworn a few hours ago I was speaking with her. I'd said goodnight to her, right? And that transition, right, from the sweet illusions of sleep, right, to face the reality of his wife's passing, right, that whiplash, right, that moment was so painful. And the Rebbe says, if you want to understand this idea of the shofar waking up on Rosh Hashanah, he says the idea, the required response to the shofar is the tragic, abrupt realization that the false assumptions upon which we build our lives have come crashing before us. We are jolted with a sudden awareness of the grievous extent that our actions have alienated us from God. Amidst the panic of the experience, we neither have the intellectual and emotional fortitude to adequately express remorse, resolve, confession, or even prayer. For the moment, we find ourselves alone, bereft of our illusions, terrified and paralyzed before God. And the idea of the jolting nature of reality, right? The idea that we have harbored too many illusions about ourselves, right, is an unbelievably disconcerting kind of moment. And again, to go back, we started talking about 9/11. I had shortly before on 9/11 itself, at the time, I was 25 years old. I was finishing Smicha NYU. I was also at the time starting as an assistant rabbi in Teaneck, New Jersey. And I had to speak Rosh Hashanah night, right? It's a week after September 11th. And I have the notes still of what I said. He said that as we're about to daven for 5762, he says, there are words that will burn my lips tomorrow. Adam Yisodam Afar V'Sofa La'afar, that man comes from the dust, and to dust he will return. B'nafsho Yavi Lachmo, at the risk of his life he seeks his daily bread, and death stalks in the office or while eating. Mashal Kecheres Hanishbar, Kechatzir Yavesh, Kechitzitz Novel, like broken pottery, dried grass, a passing shadow, like dust in the wind, like a passing dream too easily twisted into a nightmare. The reality of 5761 belies the need to voice this in words. None of us needs a new reminder of the frailty of existence, of how delicate the gossamer threads that support our civilization are, of how quickly our illusion of normalcy can be shattered. So it's a very frightening thing. But the question, right, and this is really the core question, right, is that if we have this moment, right, if we go through the shock of realizing to what degree we are spiritually asleep during the year, the question is, what do you do with it? So as you know, there's an old custom that we don't sleep during the day on Rosh Hashanah. I'm sure people are acquainted with it. When I was younger, I was very particular with this custom. In recent years, and with working intensely on Rosh Hashanah, I found the leniencies in halacha. But what's this all about? So the Bach quotes a book of sermons by a Sephardi rabbi named Drashos Ibn Shoav. And he says, you know why we don't sleep? He says, that we learn from the shofar, right? The whole point of the shofar is the shofar reminds us, right, to wake up. He says, Hasha'a Sricha Ha'ara, that the motif of this time of year is wakefulness, right? That we try to keep ourselves awake on the day of Rosh Hashanah to remind ourselves that it's a metaphor, right? That we need, if we're woken up on Rosh Hashanah, the goal is to stay awake, right? So it's interesting. If you do the math, Paro's famous dreams, right? Remember, Paro has the dreams about the cows, right? So the Torah says that happened on Rosh Hashanah, right? The Midrash says the next day, right? Rosh Hashanah, Yatza Yosef mi Beis Habar, Yosef goes out of prison, right? So the dreams were on the night of Rosh Hashanah. So what does it say regarding Paro? It says Paro woke up, and the next thing we know, he's back asleep. So the challenge is, so Yom Noraim are all about wakefulness. And that's really the whole idea of Slichos in its earliest and original form. Slichos is about getting up early in the morning, right? Rosh Hashanah, you stay awake all day, right? This idea that we can't allow ourselves to sink back into that slumber. And in fact, in the Sephardi tradition, one of the most famous Slichos begins, and it's a riff on Yonah. Ben Adam Malcha Nirdam. Son of man, why do you slumber? Come and present words of petition. Shvoch Sicha, Drosh Slicha, Me'adono Adonim. Right? Go and pour out your conversation. Ask forgiveness from the Master of Masters. Right? This is, in certain ways, the critical thing. Right? Is that, God forbid, we shouldn't be hitting snooze now. Right? We should respond to the sound of the shofar and not be paralyzed. Right? By that, it's the taking a hard look at our situation should not be paralyzing, but it's a question of being able to cultivate this new state, right? Of being able to to do things based on reality. You know, it's interesting. We started with 9/11. I'm sure many of you remember that I think we were all convinced on 9/11 that everything afterwards was going to be different. We were entering a new world. And certainly anybody who served in Afghanistan or Iraq or their family members, their world certainly was irrevocably changed. But honestly, for the rest of us, is it that different, right? We go back to sleep. It's a lot more annoying to fly now than it was before 9/11. But really the question of, did that reality call, did that awakening affect us in a profound kind of way? So it's interesting. There's a Gemara that talks about Sukkot time. Rabbi Hanania says that when he was a young man, he remembers that he never slept on Sukkot. They would fall asleep on each other's shoulders in the middle of the night because there was so much to do, right? So much excitement from the Beis Hamikdash to the Beis Medrash, learning and dancing and feasting and Simchas Beis HaShoeva, the rejoicing that took place all night. That Sukkot is a time of so much activity, right? The idea that Sukkot represents a wakefulness, not of fear. That perhaps once we've gone from the shofar of Rosh Hashanah through the process of Aseret Yemei Tshuva, that we shouldn't be afraid of being awake, right? There can be a wakefulness of being able to see so much excitement, so many opportunities in HaKadosh Baruch Hu's world. And the challenge is, isn't it really better to be awake than to be asleep? Right? The Kutzker said, there's time to sleep in the kever. God willing, we should take advantage of the time we have in this precious time of year to be able to wake up from the slumber that the Rambam says we're in all year, to hear the sound of the Rav Chovel of the captain saying, Malachan Nirdam, what are you sleeping for? And to take advantage of all of the wonderful things that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has given us to be able to fill our waking hours as we transition, God willing, to the world of Sukkot. Ikmar Chasimatova to everyone.